All right. So now we're really getting into some recent history. We said that the Cold War starts after the victory of the Allies in World War II in 1945. And we said that the Cold War is going to be an ideological divide between the Americans and the Soviets. The Soviets after World War II are going to actively attempt to try to spread communism. The United States and our NATO allies are going to do everything they can to stop it. From 1945 to 1980, it was a real struggle. Some places the United States had been successful in keeping communism from spreading. Places like Korea and Italy and Turkey. And in some instances, the United States fails pretty miserably, like in Vietnam. And we haven't really talked about the Vietnam War yet, but we will. And in Cuba. In 1980, it really truly was not clear who was winning the Cold War. Also, remember by 1980, not only had both sides built nuclear weapons, both sides now had hydrogen bombs. And hydrogen bombs are this new threat where if you dropped a hydrogen bomb today on Atlanta, there would be people in Columbus who were dead. Maybe all of us. I don't know all of the exact science, but they're infinitely bigger than what the bomb was that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in the 1980s, things turn around quickly. The end of the Cold War, I'm going to say, starts in 1980 and it ends in 1991. And there's lots of reasons for why the Cold War ends. And there's lots of debate, even among the historical community today, as far as what caused the Cold War and what caused the United States to emerge from it while the Soviet system completely collapses. I'm going to give you many of the reasons for why people say the Soviet system collapsed, what happened, and then if you want to see different viewpoints as far as what were the most important things, you can look those up on your own. So during the 1980s, the United States was undergoing a decade of economic prosperity. The 1970s were pretty rough for the United States. We had lost the Vietnam War. We had a huge political scandal where an American president, Richard Nixon, had to step down from office for basically committing election fraud. You may have heard of the Watergate scandal. He's forced to step down. There's a president, Jimmy Carter, who was raised not that far from here in Columbus, who does not do a great job economically. During the Carter administration, unemployment was high, inflation was high, energy prices were high, most importantly, gasoline. Things were rough. Well, in the 1980s, for a variety of reasons, economically, things turn around. Inflation slows down. There's incredibly rapid job growth. 1980s sees some of the lowest unemployment in American history. And new technologies emerge during an era of peace. And when I say peace, what I mean is the United States itself is not actively fighting wars. In the 50s, we fought in Korea. In the 60s and 70s, we fought in Vietnam. In the 1980s, we're not fighting any wars. Yes, we're backing some proxies, but we're not sending soldiers to combat areas. So this was a time of growth, prosperity, new technologies, and emerging peace. At the same time in the 80s, the Soviet economy, unknowns to many people in the West, was starting to crack as a result of 70 years of communist ideology. There's lots of criticism of communism that we can make. One of the things that communism doesn't do a great job with is it takes away people's motivation to work hard. It takes away people's motivation to innovate. It takes away people's motivation to to try to better themselves. Because if you go back to the basic idea of Adam Smith said, "Why do people work hard to fulfill their own selfish needs and motivations?" Communism takes that away. If I'm a communist worker, if I'm a worker in a communist state, what motivation do I have to work hard and try to get ahead if we're all going to get paid the same no matter what work we do? What motivation do I have to be a doctor or a lawyer? Or what private individual is going to start a company or a corporation that's trying to innovate when everything just gets taken by the government ultimately? And this is the problem with communism. By the 1980s, 70 years of this was starting to take its toll. The Soviet military technology was not keeping up with the technology of the US military. We're going to talk more about this later. So they're falling behind in an arms race, not just in the quantity of their weapons they're having, but also in the quality of the weapons they're having. And right as their economy is collapsing, the Soviets are actually fighting a war in Afghanistan. And this war is incredibly costly. And I don't know if you've heard this any recently, but Afghanistan is really hard to conquer. Well, the Soviets don't have any luck, and they're going to spend the equivalent of billions of dollars into this war in the 1980s as their economy is collapsing in a war that they're ultimately going to lose. So while the United States is seeing sunny skies for the first time in a long time in the 1980s, the Soviets are struggling. Now, much of the Cold War in the 1980s crystallizes between two different figures. And again, different people will say, hey, Ronald Reagan was a huge part of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some will say, not that big. Some will say the other person is a big cause of the collapse, or many layers in between. I'm not here to make judgments about these things. But Reagan is the president of the United States from 1981 to 1988. He promoted free market policies both in the United States and globally. Some would argue that much of the economic prosperity that has taken place in the 1980s was a result of his policy, especially policies to dramatically lower taxes. Now, critics have said that's not really true, that this was a natural cycle of economic growth and that his policies led to deficit spending. I'm not going to wade into all of that argument. What I'm going to say is he was the president and the American economy had taken off. One of the decisions he had made was to increase U.S. military spending. And this put a real burden on the Soviet Union. As our economy was expanding, we could afford to spend more on our military. Well, the Soviet system was collapsing and they couldn't keep up. And this was putting all sorts of economic pressure on the Soviets. One of the things that Reagan does is even his biggest critic would say he is an amazing public speaker. And he ramped up lots of anti-Soviet rhetoric, and he portrayed the Cold War as a conflict of good versus evil. The good being Western democracies that had governments by the people, influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, in free market capitalism versus the evils of communism. One of the places that he most famously said this was in front of the Berlin Wall. Now, I haven't talked about the situation in Berlin and what the Berlin Wall is yet in this class. We're going to watch a video about this in a little bit. But the basic story was Berlin, which was the capital of Germany before World War II. After World War II, Berlin, the region of Germany that Berlin is in, is East Germany. And the Soviets had liberated East Germany after World War II. Well, the agreement that the United States and its allies made with the Soviet Union is the Soviets would keep half the city and the Allies would keep half the city. And the half the city that the United States kept after the war and eventually freed was West Berlin. West Berlin, even though it was surrounded by Soviet-controlled East Germany, is actually part of West Germany. and it was not communist. And what had happened in the 1950s and 1960s is many people who had been seeking to escape the evils of communism snuck into West Berlin and used that as a gateway to escape to the West. Well, eventually in the 1960s, the Soviets got fed up with this, and they built a wall around West Berlin, keeping people from the portions of East Germany that they controlled from sneaking into the city and escaping to the West. This became a humongous symbol of communist oppression. And in this picture, I'm going to show you this in a video later on. Reagan goes to West Berlin in front of what's called the Brandenburg Gate and gives a very famous speech where he tells the Soviet Union it's time to tear down this wall. So his rhetoric ratcheted up against the Soviets during this time. And also, very famously, he proposed the Star Wars program. Now, what is Star Wars? Star Wars was a nuclear defense shield that Reagan and the military proposed building. And basically, it would have resulted in satellites in orbit would have had the ability using lasers to shoot down nuclear weapons launched from the Soviet Union to the United States. It would have cost approximately $11 gazillion. And there's some question about could we even actually do it? But Reagan and the military wanted it. Reagan and the military saw this as a protection from Soviet strikes. And it really worried the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had neither the technology or the finances to build a similar Star Wars program in the Soviet Union. And they were afraid that if the United States built Star Wars, it would tip the balance of power towards the United States. And this is ultimately going to cause the Soviets to come to the negotiation table. The other key figure in the 1980s in the Cold War is a Soviet leader named Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev becomes premier of the Soviet Union in 1985. The war in Afghanistan had been ongoing for 6 years at this point. Reagan had been president for 5 years by this point, and the Soviet system had started to collapse. Gorbachev realized that reforms needed to be made to save the Soviet system. And it's important to note he wanted to save the Soviet system. He tries to save it through two famous policies. The first one is called perestroika. This is the introduction of some limited free markets and free trade and increased economic liberalization within the Soviet Union. You didn't just have to buy from state-run stores. You didn't have to just produce your goods for state-run entities. A small amount of economic liberalization. And also limited increase in political rights, which are called glasnost. Some limited increase in freedom of the press and freedom of speech and citizen participation in the government. Now, the problem with perestroika and glasnost is once you've given a little bit to the people are going to constantly demand for more. But it's important to know that Gorbachev was, especially judging by the scales of the Soviet system, he is a liberal reformer. Now, he's also still very much a communist who deeply believes in the communist system, and he's been a communist his whole life. And he's hoping that these reforms will save communism. He's not trying to blow the system up. Probably the most important thing that Gorbachev does to try to save the Soviet economy is he ends the war in Afghanistan. He admits defeat, he pulls troops out, and ultimately this is going to lead to a power vacuum in Afghanistan. It's going to lead to the Taliban coming to power, and that's a whole other story that we'll talk about when we talk about the global war on terrorism in a later day. But Gorbachev is the leader of the Soviets during this critical decade. Reagan is the leader of the United States. And these two men are actually going to start to develop a relationship with one another. To make things even worse in the Soviet Union, in 1987, there was a major nuclear disaster. It's called the Chernobyl Disaster. A major Soviet nuclear reactor, and it was now the country of the Ukraine in Chernobyl, melts down. It's a catastrophe. It's an environmental catastrophe. It's a health catastrophe. It's a humongous disaster. Between 10 and 20,000 citizens of the Soviet Union are dead from radiation poisoning in the explosion in the first 6 months of this. But the radiation poisoning, the environmental impact is going to last for years. The West didn't really understand the scope of what had happened originally, but we knew something was happening because all the way in Western Europe, there was changing levels of radiation that couldn't be explained by natural phenomenon. The disaster is made even worse by the Soviet attempts to hide it from the outside world and also to cover it up. And this just makes the crisis even worse. So right as the Soviet economy is collapsing, right as Gorbachev is promoting policies of reform, right as the war in Afghanistan is going very poorly for them and they're getting ready to remove troops, this happens. And it's just another major, massive crisis that the Soviet system is not able to deal with and not able to rise to the challenges of solving or fixing. In the climate of all of this, in 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan sign a treaty. It's an incredibly important treaty. It's going to limit the nuclear arsenals of both states and limit arms production. The Soviets, realizing they couldn't keep up with American spending, were willing to accept cuts in their military in return for American concessions. And the most important concession they wanted that Reagan ultimately agreed to was the U.S. promise not to build the Star Wars program, so that the policy of mutually assured destruction in a nuclear war was still the dominant political theory between these two countries. And Gorbachev was using that threat to keep peace. So there is an increased dialogue. And later into his presidency, Reagan does reduce some of his anti-Soviet rhetoric in an attempt to build a relationship with Gorbachev, who was seen as a reformer. Well, the puppet states of the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, they see what's going on in the Soviet Union. They see their perceived weakness. They see a relative liberal reformer in Gorbachev in charge. And what you start to see is these Soviet puppet states, one by one, largely peacefully, are going to break away from the Soviet Union and implement liberalization, liberal style governments. It really starts in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. By 1989, Reagan was no longer president of the United States, but there was a growing movement in East Germany that the system needed to be overturned. And there had always been a longing between citizens of East Germany and West Germany to reunite into one state. Eventually, the East German government, hoping to prevent a populist uprising against it, is going to reopen the gates between East and West Berlin. And I'm going to show you this video at the end of the class of what happened when the Berlin Wall fell, and the mass just excitement and the the feeling of this long nightmare had been over. Families were reunited, friends were reunited. And the East Germans who did these, who opened the Berlin Wall in the hopes of keeping a populist uprising from happening, ultimately all it does is it causes a greater desire, and the people of East Germany see how weak the system is, and the East German communist regime collapses within a few months. The same thing can be said in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Now Romania actually had a very violent revolution, but democratic forces went out there. And it's very clear now that the Soviet system is collapsing. In 1991, hardline Soviet military leaders who are horrified by what's going on and happening, they attempt to overthrow Gorbachev. They arrest Gorbachev in a coup, and a coup is an attempt to seize power. I was driving back from, I lived in Illinois at the time. I was driving back from New Jersey where I was visiting my grandma and my grandfather. And we were driving back when we heard that Gorbachev had been arrested and there was a hardline military coup. And the fear was that hardline communism was coming back to the Soviet Union and to Eastern Europe. But there was a people's uprising against it. One of the leaders of this is a famous political leader named Boris Yeltsin, who literally leads a huge national protest against this. And eventually, the military leaders who arrested Gorbachev are forced to stand down. Many of them will commit suicide, or at least a few of them do. And Gorbachev is freed. And the attempt to reinstitute hardline communism fails. And it's not long after this that the entire Soviet system quickly collapses. And by the end of 1991, there is no more Soviet Union. So, what are the big outcomes of the Cold War? Number one, the collapse of the Soviet system, collapse of Soviet communism. Eastern Europe becomes liberated, the Soviet Union becomes liberated. New states are formed that were previously part of the Soviet system. The most important of these is going to be Russia and the Ukraine, and also some smaller states like Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, territories the Soviet Union had taken over in World War II. Probably the most important outcome, besides the collapse of communism, is the United States is the world's only superpower remaining. And in the 1990s and 2000s, what you're going to see is the United States and our allies are going to spread economic liberalization, which means free trade and capitalism globally, and political liberalization, democracy, in places that hadn't had it before. In Europe, like in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. The US becomes the dominant superpower and spreads our ideology. Germany is reunified. These two states that had been separated as a result of the Cold War have now been reunited. And Germany is reunited to one liberal democracy. Also, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been global economic growth. Over the course of the last 30 years, there's been a remarkable global growth economically, and literally hundreds of millions of people have risen out of poverty and continue to do so even in this day. There's one statistic that suggests that fewer people are living in poverty as a percent of the world's population today than have ever lived in poverty in world history. And many people, including myself, I give this as myself being one of them, credits the spread of the American economic and political systems after the collapse of the Cold War as being a main driver for this. And relative peace. Since the end of the Cold War, there hasn't been a major war between major powers fought. That doesn't mean there's not smaller conflicts. We are certainly going to roll up our sleeves and talk about the war on terror later on in this class. But even the war on terror, big picture, is a relatively minor military conflict compared to things like the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or the threat of global collapse during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the godforsaken threat of a nuclear war between two superpowers. It's ushered in a relative era of peace, which has allowed for this political and economic spread to take place globally. Why does Soviet communism collapse? Why did Chinese communism endure and endure to this day? Fundamentally, and this is a really important statement I'm going to make, so make sure you get this. The Chinese changed their system. The Chinese reforms under Deng changed everything, even to the point where they stopped really being communist economically. The Soviets were never able to reform an economic system in a way that would provide economic growth for their people successfully. And that's why their system collapsed. I don't want people to think that just because the Cold War ends, that there are no communist states left in the world. There are still some isolated examples. Cuba is communist. Vietnam is communist. North Korea is communist. China claims to be communist. And again, that's kind of a mixed bag with them, and we'll continue to talk about them later in this class. But the bottom line is the U.S. wins the Cold War. There was never a direct war between these two. That global catastrophe that everyone feared never happened. And this is going to usher in the next important period in world history, globalization. Hope you guys found this interesting. We're going to watch 3 videos in class right now. We're going to watch a portion of Reagan's speech in front of the Berlin Wall. We're going to watch the video on the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and then I'm going to show you a clip of the greatest concert that's ever been held. And it's I'm not going to spoil that one for you, but you're going to enjoy that. So everyone have a great day.